write that down. So thank you everyone who has joined our Avestria's Women Health webinar series. We're really excited for the conversation today. But before we get started, I just want to do a few logistics. One is that if you have any questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get them answered. The second thing is that if you are interested in rewatching this webinar, or if you have subscribed to our other webinars, you should have received an email with the links to the previous webinars. You'll receive a link after this webinar with the link to it, link to the recording. And the links will also be available on our website. So if you missed the email, if you don't see it, then all the links should be up on our website at some point. So please feel free to check them out, rewatch them. If you've missed part of it, feel free, it's all up there. So now that the logistics are over, I'm going to pass the metaphorical stage over to Linda Grube, who is the co-founder and managing partner of Avestria, to introduce Avestria, to introduce this webinar series, and to introduce our guests. So thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks, Ava. So today we're thrilled to have one of our entrepreneurs, Oriana Papin-Zoghbi, a co-founder of AOA, and then Dr. Katrin Eurich, a gynecologic oncologist at Boston Medical Center. I'm just going to start telling you who Avestria is. Many of you probably have heard this before, so bear with me. For those who don't know, we are a venture capital firm that was founded in 2019. We're based in San Francisco, and our background is really as healthcare operators and investors, and we have very extensive industry networks. I'm Linda. I went to business school, so I am not the scientific brains behind this. Rather, my partner, Tracy Dooley, who's on a plane today. Tracy is a biomedical engineer from USC and then went to Stanford Medical School. And the two of us met when we were working at Novartis Diagnostics together. And we've both known Ava and Michelle for literally decades. In terms of what does Avestria do, we invest in early stage, meaning seed and Series A, companies in the areas of women's health. And we define women's health as conditions that affect women exclusively, disproportionately, or differently. So that could be reproductive health, menopause, but it's also areas like Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, autoimmune disease. 80% of autoimmune disease patients are actually women. Cardiovascular disease, oncology, both of those areas affect men and women differently. In terms of where within the healthcare universe we invest, devices, diagnostics, digital health, AI, life science tools, services, and therapeutics. We do not invest in direct-to-consumer wellness products. To give you some background on why we started the fund, even though I had spent my whole career in healthcare and the life sciences, I had no idea that research in medicine have really been based on men, and that today only 11% of the funding is used to address the needs of what's really 51% of the population. And today we recognize that biological differences exist between men and women in every tissue and organ system. Truth is, until 5 years ago, I had no idea that until 1993, the FDA would not even allow women to participate in clinical trials. And obviously that led to problems because drugs and devices were not being tested on women, and many of the safety concerns that arose in the market came because they weren't tested on women. One of our biggest problems today is that still only 28% of studies that are going before the FDA are they even analyzing the data by biological sex. So that's led to a big problem with medical schools, where they're still really basing their education of clinicians on largely 150-pound men. So we need more data out there to better understand the differences between the two biological sexes. Luckily, the thing is healthcare is a $4 trillion opportunity in the US. It's a huge market. It's 18% of our GDP. It's growing over 5% annually. The good thing is investments in women's health are growing, but if you think about the fact that we made it to $1 billion in 2022, the size of that investment relative to all venture capital investments and relative to the $4 trillion opportunity remains minuscule. So we need more and more capital to go into this space to fund the amazing entrepreneurs and clinicians who are working to improve the health of women. Enough about us. So I'd like to introduce Oriana. AOA was one of our early Fund 1 investments. And then Dr. Katrin Eurich specializes in gynecological oncology. And we've asked Oriana to sort of do a fireside chat or a Q&A with Dr. Eurich. So I will ask them to take it over from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Linda and Ava, and everybody who's here today, taking time out of your busy schedules. My name is Oriana Papin-Zoghbi. I'm the co-founder, one of the co-founders and the CEO at AOA. My background has been in women's health diagnostics for about 15 years now. Prior to co-founding AOA, Anna, Alex, and I had been a part of 2 other early stage women's health diagnostics companies, Amnesia International and Precision Diagnostics, with a specific goal of bringing innovative research and technology to clinical practice to serve the needs of patients and women specifically. And I know there'll be more time down the line to talk about AOA specifically. So before I get started, I'd love for Dr. Eurich to introduce herself, and then I can start asking some questions.
Great. I'm Dr. Eurich. I am a gynecologic oncologist at Boston Medical Center. I trained both in Seattle and in Providence at Brown before taking this job here in Boston. Primarily, I treat gynecologic cancers, so ovarian, uterine, cervical, vulvar, and vaginal cancers. And that's pretty much it for me.
Amazing. Okay, great. So then we can just get started right away. Oh, and Dr. Eurich is one of AOA's advisors. She's been working with us from the very early days. Is a real strong clinical voice and advocate for ovarian cancer. So the first question for you, Dr. Eurich, is given we're focusing on ovarian cancer today, can you tell us approximately how many women in the US are diagnosed with ovarian cancer each year?
Yeah, so estimates for 2023, it's about 20,000 women will be diagnosed with ovarian cancer this year. About 13,000 women will die of ovarian cancer this year. The baseline risk in the population is about 1.3%, or 1 in 70 women will be diagnosed. But that can change depending on other risk factors, such as genetic mutations. So some women in the population have a risk of up to 50%.
Yeah. And I think what's notable about the stats that Dr. Eurich just shared is out of the about 20,000 women that will be diagnosed, over 50% will not make it. So over 50% of those diagnosed will die from ovarian cancer. So what are the early symptoms of ovarian cancer?
So symptoms of ovarian cancer are really tricky. They're super vague. They are things like bloating or feeling full more quickly or unintentional changes to your weight, vague abdominal pain. It's not usually severe. It's not usually something that drives patients to the ER. There can be changes to bladder, bowel habits, differences in bleeding patterns or new bleeding, fatigue. So as you can imagine, these are all very vague symptoms, and they can often be explained by a myriad of other things going on in a woman's life, stress. Oftentimes women attribute the majority of these symptoms just to aging. So even PCPs will attribute most of these symptoms just to aging.
And when a woman comes in, essentially either to their PCP, OBGYN, or eventually to you, what tests would a primary care physician or a gynecologist first order before that patient is eventually referred to you?
Yeah, so when patients have these kind of vague symptoms, they often present to care several times before anyone even thinks about ovarian cancer as an option. So oftentimes these women get tested for UTIs, they get tested for thyroid dysfunction, they get tested for diabetes, they get tested for a myriad of other things that are far more common than ovarian cancer, and that could be explained by these symptoms. But once ovarian cancer is on the table, generally someone will order a pelvic ultrasound that will demonstrate a mass on an ovary, and that's how they end up getting referred to a gynecologist or to me. Additional tests that might be done before they get to me are a CA-125 or CEA blood test. Sometimes they'll get a CT scan before they get to us. And then sometimes they'll have had a biopsy of one of the masses or a paracentesis for diagnosis. But it really varies what they have before they get to us.
Is it fair to say that there is no standard of care workup for these symptoms to
Yes.
assess for ovarian cancer?
Yes, that is fair to say.
Yeah. And by the time you see that patient, so she's gone through, as you stated, probably multiple visits to multiple care providers, multiple diagnostic tests and procedures. And so usually a good amount of time has gone by. By the time you see that patient, what stage of cancer do you most frequently see?
I would say that most often these patients have stage 3 or stage 4 disease. Greater than 50% of them. In general, in this country, only about 20% or less of patients are diagnosed with early stage ovarian cancer.
Yep. And how quickly does ovarian cancer progress from stage 1 to stage 4?
So there's different types of ovarian cancer. The most common is called high-grade serous, and that one's particularly aggressive. It can progress from stage 1 to stage 4 in under a year. So what's unfortunate about that timeline is, as we already talked about, these patients oftentimes come to the doctor multiple times with these symptoms, and they get all of these tests done before anyone thinks about ovarian cancer. And so you can imagine that takes, 5 or 6 months before they ever even get imaging. And during that time, their cancer has probably progressed through several stages.
That's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
For those patients, what is the long-term survival of ovarian cancer patients?
So for stage 1 ovarian cancer, the survival is about 90%, but that drops off pretty quickly. At stage 3, it's 41%, and at stage 4, it's only about 20%, and often less than that.
Yeah. And the final question we have today is what options exist, or what treatments or tests do you believe are most needed to improve the long-term survival of ovarian cancer patients? You've just noted that at stage 1, it's 90%. How do we improve essentially the care that we can give these women to see more of that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things that are really needed in this space. The first is an option for diagnosis at a much earlier stage, an option for diagnosis based just on the symptoms, something that's easy for patients to receive when they present to a PCP in urgent care, someone who doesn't treat ovarian cancer, but could at least order this test based on these symptoms. Because as we said, if it was diagnosed at stage 1, they have a much, much better shot of survival as compared to those who are diagnosed at stage 3 or 4. The other thing that would be important is that there's no effective screening method for this cancer at this point. In high-risk patients, we utilize ultrasound CA-125s, but there's been a number of studies looking at whether or not that actually helps, and none of the data indicates that it improves survival. So at this point, we really don't have a way to screen patients, even high-risk patients, for ovarian cancer.
Thank you. I know that is the last official question that I was going to ask today. Linda, I'm not sure if you want me to dive right in, or if you want to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions of Dr. Eurich before she has to run.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in now, but I'm guessing we're going to do better if we hold all the Q&A till the end of your presentation. People will be a little less shy by then, I guess. Looks like, we do have one question. Oh, Dr. Eurich, do you have any thoughts on the use of biopsies?
Yeah, so in general, we don't biopsy ovaries because they are kind of free floating in the abdominal cavity, and biopsying an ovary allows for a potential cancer to spread throughout the abdomen. In patients who already have evidence of metastatic disease on imaging, we do sometimes biopsy, say, a liver lesion or something like that.
And then we have another question from Emma. You mentioned that one type was high grade. What are the other types?
Yeah, there's a lot. So cancer can arise from any of the cell types in the ovary. So you have epithelial ovarian cancer, which arises from kind of the outside of the ovary, and that can be high grade, which is the most common, or low grade, which is far less common. It looks similar, but it grows very slowly. which you would think is better, but in fact, because it grows so slowly, it really doesn't, it doesn't, like chemotherapy doesn't work for that cancer because of how slowly it grows. So it actually is just as bad. You can also have kind of less common tumors, such as yolk sac tumors or granulosa cell tumors. Those are more common in younger patients or like extremes of age. So patients in their 20s or patients in their 80s, things like that.
Got it. So then Julia has asked, will this test screen for, so this might be better for AOA, Julia.
I'll
So
answer this question in a moment. Yeah. So I think I read the question is, will the test screen for all types of ovarian cancer or just high-grade serous? We're aiming for all subtypes, and I can talk about that when I share a little bit more about AOA and the product we're developing.
So we'll let Dr. Eurich off the hook for now, and we'll ask Oriana to tell us about sort of what motivated her to found AOA. And I got to say, just for listening to Dr. Eurich, I'm so grateful for the work that both of you are doing, because I'm now even more scared about the possibility of winding up with ovarian cancer than I was before. So Oriana, if you could talk to us about why you decided to found the company and what exactly AOA is doing.
Absolutely. Why we decided to found the company was exactly what Dr. Eurich was stating. Women are going to the doctor. Over 90% of women with these symptoms go to a doctor, the majority to their OBGYN and some to their primary care physician. And the challenge that exists is it's not for a doctor's intent or desire or willingness to help, it's that they don't have the tools. They do not have the tools. As Dr. Eurich stated, they cannot biopsy the ovaries. It poses such a high risk of spreading the disease. And there are no diagnostic tests or imaging that are sensitive or specific enough to catch the disease. So Anna, Alex, and I had been working in women's health for a very long time. We're three co-founders that had been colleagues first for over 12 years by the time we founded AOA. And the backdrop of our experience was all around women's health, how terrible the status quo was for women's health, how disproportionate innovation, funding, development existed in diseases that primarily affected women or exclusively affected women, and how challenging it was to actually bring things to clinical practice. And so we'd worked on a few tests in high-risk pregnancy. I'd worked specifically after that in HPV screening around cervical cancer. And something that drove us was this really mission to transform women's health. How can we continue to have an impact? And so we've been part of a company called Parsogen Diagnostics that successfully exited. And we'd already been through an exit, and we knew what the working for a large company was like, and said that's not our path for now. We want to have more impact. We want to have more hands-on ability to really influence women's health. And so none of us are scientists. The three of us were not in a position to go and say, we're going to go to a lab or, engineer something. We knew we had to partner with great researchers and scientists and academics. And I'd read a paper, this was in 2019, that 90% of medical innovation stays in academia. It is stuck in the research phase and rarely translated out to the point of having a product that can serve. And at AOA, we have a three-part triangle: patients, providers, and payers, right? That's typically the ecosystem in the United States. And so we went out to the research, and we went out to academics, and we went out to tech transfer offices, and we said, what are you working on in women's health? And people were really confused by our question. They're like, don't you want to see our whole portfolio? And I was like, no, I only want to see what your researchers are doing in women's health. I want to see the research in women's health. Show me what you're doing. And in parallel to that, Anna, Alex, and I had developed this: where are there big unmet needs from a diagnostics point of view, right? That's where our expertise came from. And so we had mapped out different clinical conditions and said, there's no way to diagnose endometriosis. There's no way to effectively diagnose preeclampsia. There's no way to diagnose ovarian cancer. And so we already had themes of areas that were problematic in women's health. And so then we took to the research. And in late 2019, we were introduced to Professor Sarah-Govey, who is this really leading researcher when it comes to therapeutics. And he was developing these novel antibodies to treat these markers that exist in a certain amount of cancers, including ovarian cancer. And when we learned of this research, essentially, we understood that we could use this same technology from a diagnostic point of view to try to detect ovarian cancer. And that really piqued our interest because we knew that there was a huge problem in the way that that was happening, as Dr. Eurich described today. And today, what exists are many ways around the ovarian cancer journey. So for example, CA-125 is a marker that's been cleared by the FDA for monitoring of residual disease. It means once a woman's already diagnosed, to track how she progresses. There's another product called OVA1. Once a woman already has a mass, to know who should perform the surgery to biopsy the mass, to remove and biopsy the mass, a gynecologist, oncologist, or a gynecological surgeon. And so those were all later in the journey. And as Dr. Eurich also said, there was no real prospect of screening on site. There was no technology tool biomarker that was actually showing progress. So when we saw the early data for these markers to detect early stage ovarian cancer, this is stage 1 and stage 2, and late stage ovarian cancer, we said, is there a path where we use this really in a symptomatic population? As Dr. Eurich said, these women are showing up to the OBGYN and gynecologist, and PCP, but there isn't a tool for them to assess. And so ovarian cancer just doesn't show up on the differential diagnosis until they've ruled out so many other things. They've ruled out IBS. They've ruled out if she's pregnant. They've ruled out a UTI. They've ruled out depression. 30% of women with ovarian cancer were first prescribed antidepressants before eventually getting their diagnosis. And so once they've ruled everything out, then the doctor may consider ovarian cancer. And then at that point, it's months down the line, and they show up to Dr. Eurich with late stage disease. So we said, could these markers be used in that population? There are 3 million women in the US that go to the doctor for these symptoms that eventually get worked up in some way or another. 30 million women globally that have these symptoms and go to doctor. And we said, can we design a test that targets that population? These women are going to the doctor with symptoms. We need a test that is specific enough and sensitive enough. Sensitive being doesn't miss the cancer, but specific enough being that it's not sending patients down an unnecessary workup, and quite frankly, a very invasive workup. We need it to be simple enough that doctors can adopt it at a primary care level or gynecology level, and it has to be integrated into the clinical workup easy enough so that it becomes a part of that differential diagnostic list. So that the vision is those women are going to the doctor, they're saying, I have these symptoms, and the doctor says, okay, I have a test to rule out a UTI, I can do a urine culture. I have a test to rule out ovarian cancer. I have a test to do this, and I'm going to do that as part of my workup because we know that if we do this testing early and we actually catch that cancer early, then we can refer her to the care that she needs. And that was the path that we embarked on, this pretty audacious mission to try to diagnose ovarian cancer earlier. Nobody's been able to do it effectively before. It's, as all of you probably know around the table, not the easiest to raise money around ovarian cancer or around women's health generally. And so 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, we launched AOA by getting some non-dilutive funding first to really prove out the thesis scientifically and be able to analyze samples from 500 different women and really see, could we see signatures and across what types of cancer. So to answer, I believe it was Julie's question, we actually see uniform signatures across all subtypes of epithelial ovarian cancer, high-grade serous, low-grade serous, mucinous, and that gives us a lot of confidence that we won't have to only look at high-grade serous, for example. And we also see very good sensitivity in early stage, so stage 1 and 2, and in late stage, stage 3 and 4. And so with that early research and the conviction that we had, we went on to raise our first round of capital. That's when Avestria were really early believers in AOA and in the team and in the mission we were on, as well as some other great people around the table. And we raised some money to start to build a really small team and transfer the technology. We worked first with a development partner, essentially, to get some proof of concept testing done, understand, could this innovation actually be translated to something that could be applicable in a clinic, to build out our regulatory strategy and understand how we were going to bring this to market from a regulation point of view, our payer strategy to understand how is this going to be covered. Far too often, the economic burden for women's health lies on the women themselves. I see many, many places where women are paying for their own endometriosis testing. One of the survivors in our video had to pay for her own ultrasound at an ER because they didn't think it was necessary. And we find that absolutely unacceptable. I have yet to find a gentleman who's had to pay for his own PSA test. And so, we wanted to make sure that this was something that was going to be reimbursable, and that could actually provide women the care they needed without having to go through the economic burden. So that was about 2021, building out our strategy, continuing to build out the technology, and understanding not only ovarian cancer, but could these markers be really applicable to other cancers as well? And were we sitting on a gold mine of potentially novel biomarkers? And from there, essentially, we discovered that gangliosides are an uncharted territory. Nobody in the world has developed a diagnostic to this biomarker class. People have developed diagnostics to ctDNA or circulating tumor DNA, to RNA, to different kinds of markers in the blood, but nobody's developed a diagnostic using gangliosides. And the family of gangliosides is quite large. We're looking at two, GD2 and GD3 for ovarian cancer. But when we develop our technology, we'll be able to apply it to so many other cancer types. And that got us really excited about the potential of early diagnostics in other women's health conditions as well. And so from there, we learned the hard way that working with a contract developer was never going to be as fast or as motivated as having your own team. So we went on to rent a tiny bit of lab space at the back of somebody else's lab space to get our own hands in the lab, and grew our team by a couple more scientists, and really showed that we could expedite development that way. And we were hitting some really great clinical milestones. We were hitting some strong regulatory milestones. We began enrolling for our prospective trial here in the US. And that led us to raise our next round of capital, which just closed this past summer. And that has really allowed us to grow AOA. We are now opening up our own lab. It's an 8,000 square foot facility in Denver, Colorado, where we will have our own development team. We're bringing on a full-time chief scientific officer now, as Professor Zoghbi is the inventor, and being an academic has been part-time, but we're really growing our leadership team and bringing on a full, strong scientific team. And we're continuing to engage with the FDA and enroll patients in our study. So right now we just crossed 240 patients enrolled in our study. We are seeing some really great data about the behavior of OBGYNs. OBGYNs are actively enrolling. Surprisingly, and this is a conversation off the record with Dr. Eurich, faster than oncologists are enrolling, but that's the population we need, right? The gynecologists are really excited. They see so many of these patients, and women are getting enrolled and flying through our study, which is something that we're really excited about. This is a long journey. Diagnostics take time for us to be able to prove out this indication specifically, enroll the number of patients, and then have the necessary follow-up period, which we've aligned upon with the FDA. It takes a bit of time. And then from here, essentially, our goal is to finalize the development of the assay, which is going to be a blood test that is distributable, which means this test can go to clinics all around the US and internationally. We don't plan to have a centralized lab. We plan to distribute this, again, on our mission around access of technology. So we will have the distributable version of our technology developed. We'll have our study finalized. We'll submit to FDA. And then at that point, we'll be able to hopefully get our clearance and actually bring this test to market and start on the pathway to adoption. And so that's the journey that we're on today. It's been 3.5 years. Today, we're 13 people total. A lab space that's under demolition, but will open on January 2nd, and rapidly growing our scientific team into the new year so that we can continue to hit our milestones and bring this forward. And in a serendipitous way, about a year into building AOA, Alex, my co-founder's mother, was diagnosed with stage 3B ovarian cancer in the UK. And we lived it. Before this, we knew it. We we read about it, we knew other people, and then we lived it, and we saw the journey that she went on. And even with us knowing and advocating for her and saying, take her here, we know these symptoms are not just bloating, this is not just constipation. The healthcare system didn't have a tool like AOAs, and deciding to go to surgery is not an easy decision. And so we've lived it now. We know so personally and so deeply what it means for these women going down this journey to be on having a choice of, do I have my ovary removed permanently at the risk of maybe not having ovarian cancer, or at the risk of having ovarian cancer and actually doing it? We've heard the stories of hundreds of survivors and family members that were not lucky enough to survive. And that's what deeply motivates us and keeps us going on what is not an easy journey. I do not want to sugarcoat it. Diagnostics are not easy. They are the underdog of the industry, but they need to happen because we won't know what to treat or operate on if we can't diagnose the disease better. And so I've talked a lot and I have ability to talk a lot. So I'll pause to give everybody a chance maybe to ask some questions, and I'm happy for it to be an active discussion.
So Oriana, I'm just going to ask one question and then I'll hand it over to Ava, and Ava can read the questions from the audience. But when can we hopefully expect this test to be on the market, assuming all goes well and, the FDA is, supportive, which no one can predict. But when can we hope that we can go to our doctors and get this test?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Linda. As you said, there are certain things which are in our control and certain things which aren't, including regulatory and a number of other things. Right now, we are tracking towards having a test in the market in about 3 years from now. We're working as fast as we possibly can. And I would say that for us means a regulatory cleared, which is available to clinicians. Obviously, today we're actively enrolling in a study. If you know a woman with symptoms, or if you want to be involved in the study in any way, happy to chat offline. But I would like at clinics and with the ability for physicians to start to order the test in about 3 years.
And then I just want to tell the audience that one of the things, you can tell listening to Oriana what an amazing spokesperson she is for the company and for the field. For those of you who don't know, once the Fed started raising rates, it became incredibly difficult for early stage companies to raise money. And not surprisingly, women's health is an incredibly difficult area to raise venture capital for. And, I think a lot of that's just lack of education about the clear need. A lot of venture capitalists are men, and we love them, but they may not be as familiar with the needs in women's health as women are. But I wanted to point out that when Oriana mentioned that they were able to raise a round recently, that's amazing. They did an oversubscribed round in this environment, which just goes to show the strength of Oriana's ability to convey the opportunity to investors, but also just the belief that people have in AOA, the company, and the management team. And I'll let Ava ask the questions from the audience now.
Thank you, Linda.
All right. Thanks, Linda. And thanks, Oriana. Actually, jumping off of Linda's latest point, we do have questions from the audience. I'll get to them in a second. But how were you able to successfully raise an oversubscribed round in one of the worst funding environments, at least I've seen in years?
So I would say there are two things, one which is a little bit theoretical and one which is a little bit more tactical. Number one is continue to hit milestones and build value in the company, right? And I think that's like kind of fluff words and easy to say, but our focus at AOA tactically was it was a give and take of preserve cash, but not to the point of slowing down the company so much where we were not continuously hitting milestones, because otherwise you end up in this limbo of being alive for 6 months, but actually not progressing. And so this was a constant back and forth between us on the financial side and our teams on the execution side of how do we preserve, but how do we not slow down? How do we preserve? How do we not slow down? And that was in combination with working with our board at the time, with working with our advisors, is how do we continue to hit milestones? How do we continue to de-risk, right? So whether it was enrolling patients, whether it was meeting with the FDA, whether it was hitting certain development milestones, so that every quarter that we were raising money, we were a little bit less risky and a little bit less risky. And no, we were not going to be able to do all these things like open a lab because we needed money, but we were a little bit less risky every quarter that went by. While the surrounding area was just getting worse and worse, right? The financial markets were getting worse. Everything around us was getting riskier, but we were trying to show investors every quarter, but we did this, we're a little less risky, we're a little less risky. So I would say that's how we did it at the company. And then on the other part, around the fundraising part, my background is in commercialization and in business development. And so really what it came down to is just using my sales management skills, which is having an incredibly strong funnel of investors, talking to a lot of people, not believing anybody when they said, oh, we'd like to lead the round, without really getting into the deep diligence of like, is it actually happening? Because, and not stopping conversations with others, having a really clear follow-up and tactical guidance is like, what we made it clear at AOA that we were going to get back to every investor communication within 24 hours. And with the exception, we would let them know if something was 48 hours. I fielded most of that so that my team was not incredibly busy. If there was something with a very technical expertise, I would bring them on. So it was just strong communication, I think, and running a very solid fundraising process, I think helped as well.
No, thank you. I mean, as Linda said, it was an incredible accomplishment, and we're happy that we could be part of that in some way. And now I want to go over to questions from the audience. So one of them was, how is your test different than ctDNA, which is like Grail's test?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll talk about the markers and then a little bit about Grail separately. So ctDNA, a circulating tumor DNA, is essentially DNA that's being shed from the tumor and is circulating in the blood. And so we need to be able to sequence that to be able to identify the DNA. What's unique or about DNA is that DNA can evolve, it can shift, it's not a stable marker. But also in the case of circulating tumor DNA, a large amount of tumor volume or tumor burden needs to be present for it to be shedding into the blood in enough quantities for us to detect it in the blood, which is often very, very challenging in ovarian cancer, because ovarian cancer tumors are essentially not often one large tumor. They can be small mets along the fallopian tube or in the ovary, and very often is it a large volume burden disease. And so what we've been able to see from Grail's data, from Exact's data, from anybody that has studied ctDNA in ovarian cancer, is very low sensitivity in early stage disease. There is not enough for them to pick up in early stage disease. Gangliosides are very different markers. First, they're lipids, so they're not DNA. Lipids are like cholesterol, like LDL. They're very stable markers. Additionally, gangliosides essentially are embryonic in nature, which means they begin to grow right at the onset of tumor cell growth, which means that we're not challenged with the same challenges as ctDNA of prevalence of the marker in early stage. It's actually quite elevated in early stage because they begin to grow early on. So the biology behind the markers is quite different. But then how do we adopt technology around them? The nature of Grail's technology is a centralized lab that uses sequencing and very specialized blood tubes. You can only collect with what's known as Streck blood tubes, which is not a standard blood tube. And all those samples are sent to the Grail labs, and everything is run at Grail. So there's a turnaround time, but there's also an access time. And then there's also a reimbursement right now. All of Grail's testing is out-of-pocket cost. None of it is reimbursable yet. And so from that point of view, when we think about technology, AOA is quite different in the sense that we use standard blood tube testing, a standard lab workflow. So this is an ELISA assay, which means that it runs 99% of labs across the world have an ELISA platform reader. So we're aiming to develop a reagent kit that has the 96 well plate, the reagents and the controls in the box that gets sent to lab, where they use the standard. If you go to a blood office and you get a lavender cap blood drawn, the standard blood tubes can get sent to their own labs to address the access part. And we're really looking at what are our options from a payer perspective so that this is reimbursable. And we already have identified certain codes that we can crosswalk to, or that means like leverage that code to potentially bill against that as well. So those are from a technology point of view. And then lastly, from a strategy point of view, Grail is in the MCED market, which is the multi-cancer early detection. So it's looking at one blood draw, looking at right now 10 to 12 different cancers. AOA is focused on the symptomatic and individual cancer identification market, which is women are going to the doctor presenting with symptoms of ovarian cancer. This is a test for that. We're looking at a different test in triple negative breast cancer or endometrial cancer. Again, very specific to disease condition rather than a catch-all screening test.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're not technically going the questions in order. We're going kind of based on themes. So Julia asked that you mentioned that this is a diagnostic tool for women who present with symptoms. Do you think that this will ever be used as a screening tool in the general population? And was there a thought to target high-risk women instead of women who present with symptoms, which was kind of on the line of you talking about the various different tests?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are fantastic questions. So we're actually doing studies in both of those populations outside of our symptomatic population. So I'll answer the second part first. We evaluated all the different potential indications we could explore. High risk women being women with a genetic condition, family history, BRCA. We looked at women that already have a mass. We looked at women that were symptomatic. And we looked at women general population screening. We looked at as a companion diagnostic. Are there certain treatments in which an elevation of these markers could guide those treatments? And I can tell you that through our clinical collaborations, we're studying all of them. We're studying the screening population. We're studying monitoring of disease. We're studying the BRCA population. And when we decided essentially to move forward in the symptomatic population, it was multifold. It was where we saw that there was enormous unmet need and an ability to have a real impact on patient lives, where we saw a clear regulatory pathway. That's a big one for us because we can have the best intentions, but if we can't execute on it in a manner that's actually going to get a test on the market, then that's really challenging. And the culmination of that analysis led us to the symptomatic population as our first step. And then from there, really add on indications, which we're today studying through clinical collaborations. We know the unmet needs, and now we know the regulatory pathways. The unknowns or the biology. And that's what all of these research collaborations are doing. We need to understand the performance of our markers in each of these different populations so that we can understand what comes second, what comes third, et cetera.
All right, thank you. And then Kathleen said, this is such a great concept / company. So congratulations, Oriana. And she asked if you could speak a little bit more about the size cost of your proof of concept study, as well as the current study of the 240 patients. Is the second study an RCT? What types of patients are you recruiting, et cetera?
Yep. So our first study was multifold. First it started in 200 women with tissue samples. Then we did those 200 women's matched blood samples, so another 200 blood samples. And then we did another 400 independent blood samples. So overall, our proof of concept study, our whole proof of concept study, because in theory, each one was a part proof of concept. We staged it, right? So when we saw it in tissue, then we saw it in blood, then we saw it in large. So overall, we did 200 tissue samples and 600 blood studies. And the overall cost of that, that's a hard one because there's costs of like what it costs and what we paid our academic collaborators for it. And then there's the overhead costs of the company. I would say if we talk about just around the academic collaboration side, that was about $300,000, but obviously that doesn't include what it takes to run the company to actually have that happen, which is a little different. And then the second, for our prospective pivotal trial, it is a double-blinded randomized control study. So essentially, the study is double-blinded to the clinicians and to everybody involved in the study. It enrolls women with symptoms. So there's a very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria based on the Goff Ovarian Cancer Symptom Index that's adopted in clinical practice. And so that's all been aligned on with the FDA. And then I think the second part of the question was timelines and cost. So again, this is if we were not around the predicaments of having to raise capital and had all the money in the world, and we're just able to scale the study from day one and do it that way, it would take us about a year to enroll the study. And then a year, there's a 12-month follow-up period. So overall, no cash constraints means this is about a 2-year study. The reality is that's just not the case. It is a startup. We started the study before we had closed our fundraise. And so we had scaled only to 10 sites in the beginning, and then we could scale to 30 sites, and then we could scale to 50 sites. So it ends up being about a year more, about 3 years overall, because it's a scaled approach, because you're a small company that has the capital constraints along the way.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then we actually have, I believe we have time for one more question, but this is for you, Dr. Eurich. I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly. So one of our anonymous attendees asked, heterogeneous myometrial echotexture that might be related to endomyosis versus fibroid changes, biopsy or removal with multi-genetic damage. think one of the words may have been misspelled there, but I guess they're asking what your recommendation is for that. And if you want, you can see the question in the Q&A box in case I misrepresented it in any way.
I would say adenomyosis or any of these kind of changes in the uterus are distinct from ovarian cancer. The general kind of standard of care would be for removal and pathologic evaluation of that. So doing a hysterectomy and it's diagnosed on final pathology. I don't think that there's any relation to the AOA test, but maybe Oriana can answer that question.
I don't believe there is any relation to the AOA test for where we are today.
It wouldn't affect the efficacy of an AOA test. Even if a patient has had a hysterectomy, or a myomectomy, meaning like removal of part of the uterus, the tissue that comprises the ovarian, like primary ovarian cancers, is completely different from the tissue that comprises the uterus.
Okay. Thank you. And then we have one more question, and then I'm going to pass it back off to Linda and say thank you to our speakers. An anonymous attendee said, what do you suggest, and I believe this might be for both of you, a middle-aged woman should do if she has a family history of stage 4 ovarian cancer? Is it worth considering a hysterectomy?
I would say that the first step of a patient who has a family history of ovarian cancer is to see if that patient ever had any genetic testing. If they did and it was positive, then that patient should also have genetic testing. If it's unknown, that patient should probably have genetic testing to see what their risk of ovarian cancer is. If their genetic testing is negative, we consider them to be at average risk of ovarian cancer, so that 1.3%. And there's really no indication for them to have their ovaries removed prophylactically. One thing that's kind of out there is that we think about 50% of ovarian cancer start in the fallopian tube. And so nowadays, when patients ask for surgical sterilization, meaning to have their tubes tied, one thing that we talk to them about is, do you want your tubes tied, or do you want us to remove your fallopian tubes in its entirety, which we think decreases your risk by about 50%.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's all the time that we have for questions. For those of you who did not get your question answered, I think we covered most of them. Linda will give you an email address and we can pass it on. We can try and pass it on to the right person. So I'm actually going to thank the speakers again from my perspective and then pass it back to Linda, who's going to wrap up the webinar just by telling you a little bit more about Avestria.